En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo, del Espíritu Santo. Amén. So, God, grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, which is pretty much everyone, since I'm clearly not you, God. At least not the last time I checked. And while you're at it, God, please give me the courage to change what I need to change about myself, which is frankly a lot, since once again, I'm not you, which means I'm not perfect. It's better for me to focus on changing myself than to worry about changing other people who, as you'll no doubt remember me saying, I can't change anyways. Finally, give me the wisdom to just shut up whenever I think that I'm clearly smarter than everyone else in the room, that no one knows what they're talking about except me, or that I alone have all the answers. Basically, God, grant me the wisdom to remember that I am not you. Amen.
Amen.
Great. Thank you for joining us. A lot of gratitude to the LGBTQ and Allies Committee for their invitation for the two of us to chat for a bit this evening.
My pleasure.
So I think how our program is going to work this evening is we have about half an hour, 45 minutes, where I think just for a Q&A portion, conversation between the two of us. The theme for the night is Cura, Personalis and LGBTQ Catholics, specifically as the beginning of the St. Ignatius Lenten series on this topic. And after about these 30, 45 minutes, Misha and Michael will coordinate a Q&A from the crowd. So folks, if you have questions at all throughout our conversation tonight, please in the chat, instead of sending them to the large group overall, just go ahead and send them straight to Mish. She is the other person who led our opening prayer. And then she and Michael will coordinate those for everyone else throughout our evening. So Father Martin, again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to dive right in with our first question, if that's okay.
Great.
So I'm a student at the School of Theology and Ministry, which is a part of Boston College. I'm the facilitators. I'm a little nervous. I'm very excited to be with you tonight.
Thanks. Don't be nervous. No need.
Thanks. I'm the facilitator, one of the two, of our BC group called Axios, which is a group for our LGBTQ plus or queer undergraduates, where they can reflect on the intersection of their spiritualities, their sexualities, their gender identities. One of our students wanted me to start tonight by asking you this question. She says, it's special to know that members of the clergy invest time and energy into standing up for our community, especially when it can feel so rare. Why do you choose to work with and advocate for LGBTQ plus Catholics in particular?
What a great question. And, you know, I think it does have to do with the topic of Cura Personalis. Cura Personalis, I'm sure most of you know, means care for the person. I know Nick knows that because he worked in the Jesuit high school.
Yes, sir.
And it means it's usually sort of used in educational circles. So the idea is that in a Jesuit school, the whole person would be cared for, not just the intellect, but the spirit too, the spirit, the body, the emotional life, the mental life, every part of you. Care for the whole person. And really, I think, you know, in terms of the church needs to care for the whole person. And some of the people that it needs to care for are LGBTQ people. Why do I do it? Well, you know, the main reason is because I'm a Christian, and Jesus is continually reaching out to people who feel like they're on the margins, right? The Roman centurion, you know, is on the margins. He's not Jewish. The woman at the well, she's not Jewish. She's a Samaritan. Zacchaeus, the tax collector. There's so many stories in the Gospels about him going out, people with various illnesses. So Jesus asks us to go out to the margins. Now, I don't think there's any group that feels more marginalized in the church than LGBTQ people. So that's the first reason. Second reason is, you know, Cura Personalis. I mean, the Jesuit ideal of, you know, caring for the whole person. And the whole person includes, you know, person's sexuality, right? Kind of attending to that and talking to them about that. And then I think the third thing, one of the great things that the Jesuits have been doing recently, they're called, it's a terrible term, the universal apostolic preferences. It's a really terrible term. The idea is that sort of ministries that should be kind of part of all of our ministries. And one of them is walking with the excluded, right? Now, at St. Ignatius and Chestnut Hill and BC, maybe you don't feel excluded, but in general, LGBTQ people feel excluded. So I think it's just part of being a Christian, being a Catholic, being a Jesuit, and I'm happy to do it. I'm honored to do it.
That's excellent. Thank you. So some folks can view your ministry as challenging church teaching, but in your books and in other interviews, you often state that you're not doing that. Do you mind, before we go on, just kind of breaking that open a little bit more for us, please?
Yeah, so I'm really careful about saying that. I'm a Jesuit priest, and so my ministry is not challenging church teaching. But within that church teaching, there's a lot we can do. And also, I think one of the problems is that people tend to think of church teaching as a few lines in the catechism, right? So, one, we should treat LGBTQ people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, which most people forget about. And then two, the teaching about homosexual relations and marriage. That's a part of church teaching on LGBT people. The other part of church teaching is Jesus, right? Is the way Jesus treated people who, again, were on the margins. And to look at those stories again, the Roman centurion wasn't Jewish, and the guy, Jesus didn't say to him, "Get away from me," right? The woman at the well, I mean, as you know, as a theology student, she's been married 5 times and she's living with someone who's not her husband. So she's kind of in an irregular sexual situation, right? So her sexual history and her current sexual status. He doesn't send her away, right? He talks to her. He reveals himself as the living water. And then the third story I always like is Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who's kind of hated by everybody, right? And so we see Jesus reaching out to people on the margins and welcoming them into the community. And so that's church teaching too. And so I think what happens is we get so, focused on those 1 or 2 lines in the catechism that we forget, Jesus, so Jesus is church teaching. And that part I'm not challenging.
I love that. Thank you. When I was a high school teacher, I taught your book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, to our sophomores in our New Testament course. And it was very much in the way to help introduce them to that person of Jesus.
Thanks.
Not just to know the catechetical pieces, right, but to really form and foster that relationship.
Yeah, and also like to encounter him as mystery. I mean, I always say that God didn't come incarnate God's self as a book, right? It's a person. And so we need to help LGBTQ people encounter the mystery of Jesus Christ in their prayer, in the sacraments, in life, in service, all the ways that anybody else would. The problem is that, people treat them so poorly, and really, again, you're lucky at St. Ignatius and Chestnut Hill, but in many places, they're really treated like dirt, right? So that's one reason for the ministry. It's another reason for the ministry.
Thank you. So shifting a little bit more towards the specifics of Cura Personalis and of Lenten practice. So traditional Lenten practices, right, include prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. What does that look like for queer folk, for queer Catholics? I'm thinking of the 2 groups, right? One, that they can struggle with the church and feel like they're in a perpetual Lent. Another group of queer Catholics who can feel really connected to the church and are searching for a deeper relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, I would say, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. I think for the LGBT person you're saying who doesn't feel connected to the church, we can invite them to feel connected to God, right, through prayer. And I think one of the difficulties, for LGBTQ people is that if they feel rejected by the church, they often feel rejected by God. And so prayer during Lent may be a way of kind of reconnecting, right? The fasting, it's the same fasting that anyone does. And the almsgiving, you might do something that's, supportive of LGBT ministries, right? To really feel like you're supporting, that part of the church's community. But I think that, you're right. It also feels to a lot of LGBTQ people like these Lenten practices are, yet another thing that are kind of sort of imposed on us. But, especially when it comes to prayer, I think it can be a way of helping LGBTQ people connect to God, even if they don't feel connected to the church.
That's really beautiful. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm thinking of your book right now, My Life with the Saints. You share stories of saints that accompany you throughout your life. A lot of focus I like on Joan of Arc. My mom is named Joan, and she's watching. Hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Joan.
Whether she's gonna love that, thank you. Whether traditional or contemporary, who are some saints that queer folk and allies can read about and encounter during Lent?
That's a great question. It has to be said that among the saints, however many there are, I've heard so many different numbers, but among the saints there are LGBT saints. All right, how we maybe not T, but there's some people that even talk about Joan of Arc, and look at her and are thinking about that. But I think that there are clearly gay and lesbian and bisexual saints. How do we know that? Because it's a percentage of the population, right? Mm-hmm. And so it goes to reason. And a lot of the saints are religious and priests and things like that. Not that they ever broke their vows or broke their promises of celibacy, but that they were homosexual or they were bisexual, right? Or they were lesbian. So we have to really acknowledge that, and to say that there are LGBT saints in heaven, right? And beyond that, beyond the canonized saints, there are people who are holy people who are in heaven, right? Who are our brothers and sisters who are LGBTQ, all right? So that's clear. That's the first thing to say, that among the saints. Now, because of church history and because that, LGBTQ identity, is fairly recent, right? Who knows, who is gay, who is not gay. But I do know, recently, two people that I point to that people can look at. One is Father Michael Judge, who was as you may know, the first victim of 9/11, who went in to help the firefighters. He was a fire chaplain. He was gay, and his Franciscan brothers will tell you that. So there's someone, I believe, who is in heaven, right? There's even a beautiful Father Michael prayer. It's basically like, "Keep me out of your way, God," which is a great prayer. And then the other one is Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen, the great spiritual writer, who died in, I think, like 1990, was gay, right? And that's, his biographer says that. I was reading a book of his letters recently called Love Henry, and he's gay. So there are more contemporary ones. Now, I think that when we look back, there are people that I would say there's a good chance that they were gay. I think St. John Henry Newman, when you read his letters to his very close friend, Ambrose St. John, he has to be buried with him, right? So do we know for sure? No, we don't know for sure, but it seems like it would be at least possible. So there are gay saints in heaven. I think Michael Judge and Henry Nouwen are the ones, even though they're not canonized, are the ones that I would pray to as kind of models.
That's great. Thank you. I've heard those stories before, and I love them. Thank you for pointing those out.
You're welcome.
Thinking about another book of yours, 7 Last Words, an invitation into deeper friendship with Jesus. You offer some really beautiful reflections about Jesus's last statements from the cross. I'm also thinking of Jesuit theologian Ignacio Ellacuría, martyred in 1989 in El Salvador for standing up for speaking out for the poor there. Ellacuría wrote that the body of Christ that was crucified on Good Friday is still being actively crucified in history in the bodies of marginalized and suffering peoples. So I think my question is, especially during this global synodal process, where we're all being asked to kind of raise up our voices, what can the church, maybe the magisterium in particular, or the overall church, whoever, what can the church learn from sitting at the foot of the cross of marginalized queer persons?
Wow, what a great question. To again go back to the story of the Roman centurion, which you guys probably remember. So Jesus is in Capernaum, the centurion comes up to him, says his servant needs healing. And he says, but you don't have to come to my house because Lord, I'm not worthy that you enter under my roof, which is the words we say every day at Mass. By the way, the words we say every day or every Sunday at Mass are not from Mary or Saint Joseph. They're from an outsider, right? They're from a non-Jew, which I think is really powerful. Right before the Eucharist, we repeat the words of an outsider. And he says, you don't have to come to my house because, because I have people under my authority. I say to one guy, go, he goes. I say to another guy, come, he comes. And Jesus says, never in Israel have I seen faith like this. And oftentimes when I think of, and when I hear the things that LGBTQ Catholics put up with, I mean, really being targeted from the pulpit and being fired from their jobs, which I think is unjust. And, really just having these terrible statements made about him, most recently about transgender people. I think how great is their faith? These are people that, and I think the church can learn from that. These are people who, and I would imagine a lot of the people on this call tonight, all 40 of you, are LGBT people who have decided to, be Catholic and have made a commitment, to not only Church of St. Ignatius, but to the Catholic Church, right? I would say how great is your faith? Right? So I think that the church can learn a lot from that, from the faith of people who persevere, even in the face of marginalization, exclusion, and real kind of contempt often. And then I'd also say that what the church really needs to do with LGBTQ people in the synod and beyond the synod is to listen, right? To listen to their experiences, and not just of their experiences of church and, any kind of frustrations they would have, but their experiences of God too, and who is Jesus for them, and who is God, and prayer, and and I think it's one of the lines I think A.O. Cura would appreciate is from John Sobrino, who said that the poor are the primary recipients of the gospel, and I would say that those on the margins are. This is where Jesus is always going, to the margins, and so if he's going to the margins, why wouldn't we want to listen to the margins where he is? And I think one of the groups he is very powerfully with today is LGBTQ people. And I would say how great is their faith.
I really appreciate that. Again, thanks. In thinking about kind of the sufferings, right, of, like you mentioned, of queer folk, as a former high school teacher, I'm thinking about the data that illustrate that like queer Catholics and queer Catholic youth in particular can experience much higher rates of anxiety, of depression, of harm, and can really struggle with what that looks like, of kind of being themselves fully and loving them and accepting themselves fully in their communities. One of the insights that you share in Jesus of Pilgrimage is how you kind of became overwhelmed by the implications of the onset of your carpal tunnel. Kind of from what you've learned, what wisdom can you offer queer Catholics from your own discernment of learning how to maybe like do only what is necessary, asking for the help that you need, saying no to good things sometimes?
Yeah, funny enough, that happened when I was at STM, well, at the old Weston, STM. I think it's a question that's, people have even more difficult physical problems and more difficult problems than carpal tunnel. And I was using that kind of as an example of, what kinds of things we learn. I think the first thing is that, you can't do everything, right? You can't, so I can't, as much as I'd like to write 1 million books, like people probably wouldn't want to read 1 million of my books. I can't because of the carpal tunnel, I'm limited. But that's okay. The second thing is that never to despair. I think that's probably the key thing. Despair, I mean, this is like Ignatian Spirituality 101. Despair is never coming from God. It just isn't. And hope always is. So voices, and particularly in the pandemic, I think this has been important for people, voices that help to encourage you, to give you hope, to give you uplift, that's coming from God. And I mean voices like interior voices, but also people, friends who talk to you or things that you hear. And then, I think the third thing is that it reminds you that everybody suffers, right? And that it in a sense, it connects you with people who suffer and who struggle. I really like that old that old adage, everybody is fighting a battle, so be kind to them, right? I was reading an article in the New York Times today about Frank Bruni's new book. Frank Bruni's a writer who lost his eyesight.
Okay.
And he said he sometimes thinks about people wearing the struggles that they're undergoing, like in front of them, like a sign, like my mother's sick, or I have cancer, or I have a mental illness that I'm struggling with, you know what I mean, or I have a disability, some sort of disability. So I think when you have those experiences, it reminds you that you're part of the human race, right? So yeah, but I think for LGBTQ people, um, I think that I have to be very careful because I don't want to always paint LGBTQ people like victims.
Mhm.
I get a lot of pushback for that. I mean, they contribute to the church, they have joyful lives, they flourish, right? But I do think that there's a certain kind of, I would say, suffering that LGBTQ Catholics go through. Because when they walk into a church, if they're in another town or whatever, they can't be assured that they're not going to hear something terrible from the pulpit. And that's a kind of dis-ease, right? It's like a disease, but it's a dis-ease. And I think it's a kind of suffering. And then oftentimes they get attacked, from the pulpit or even by their local bishop. So it can be very difficult for them. And I think one of the things I try to do is just listen, to raise up their voices and then to advocate for them. It's a long rambling answer, but yeah.
I like it. I find myself clinging to that initial phrase of kindness, being kind to others. I did my research for this. A few days ago on American Media, you published your kind of what you're doing for Lent this year, and one of the things you mentioned you were giving up is being unkind, like to always try and be kinder to folks.
Yeah,
really
I'm 61 years old. How old are you, by the way, Nick?
38.
Yeah, so I'm older than you are, and I've given things up. I've taken up penances. And I just think trying to be a kind person I think it's hard too, to everybody. So that's my Lenten fast is trying to be kind.
That's beautiful. When I was a teacher, I like the trial by fire, kind of like learning very much, like how do I love no matter what.
Yeah, I love your students, right?
Very much so.
Yeah,
that ministry forms you. And also kind of connecting to what you said a moment ago, how the very much, right, like the queer Catholic experience is not only one of suffering. And I struggled when drafting these questions and when working with the parish committee on this it's Lent, right? So like it's kind of that space of 40 days and that. And so I do have one or two more questions kind of around that before we shift a little bit.
Sure.
All right. So I'm in looking at the apostolic exhortation from Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia, right, where he talks about love, he calls the church a field hospital. And again, kind of especially because queer youth can be at greater risk of harm than other folks. In your own ministry, and especially in so many of these conversations you've had over the years, what are best practices that you've encountered from others, from like educators or youth ministers or parents, that like best practices for how do they help the queer youth in their community?
I think one of the best ones I've heard, and I hear this from queer Catholics and also from those who minister to them. It's a very simple one, which is listen to them, because they know what they need, right? And that may differ. It might differ in a Jesuit high school, or a Catholic high school and a Jesuit high school. It might differ in a parish it actually might differ between St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Cecilia's in Back Bay. I mean, it even might differ there, in terms of what has the parish done, what has the school done, what has the high school done or college done. And so I think that's a really transformative thing to hear, because usually it's the church saying, all right, here's what you need. Now we're going to give it to you. Right. But I think it can be surprising, particularly for young LGBTQ Catholics, to be able to have that voice and have the church listen to them. I also think sort of doing your best is really important. Now, what do I mean by that? That sounds like a kind of a cheesy like poster or something. But what I mean is that if you're in a school where the faculty or the community usually, or even the bishop is more resistant, do your best, in terms of like an outreach group. Maybe you can't do an outreach group. Maybe you can't do a GSA, but maybe as a teacher, maybe you can let people know that your classroom is a safe space, and let people know just by your words and your actions that you're open to talking to LGBTQ students, right? High school, college. So that I found that very helpful too, because a lot of, I give a lot of talks these days to high school, colleges, parishes, and they're always, it's natural. They're always comparing themselves against, this college or that parish, or we're not doing this, and I think that they can get down on themselves. It's good to have goals, right? But it's also good to know that, even a small step forward is helpful. I'm really big on these small steps. One of the things I struggle with, and maybe people might disagree with me, how many are here now? 40 people might disagree with me. Oftentimes when there's some small step forward, let's say Pope Francis, for example, recently he said parents should not denigrate or in any way show any sort of thing other than welcome to children with different sexual orientations. Now, that's a big deal. But a lot of people say, oh, not enough. That's not enough. Big deal. Well, I think part of the thing is we have to remember that, what might not be a big deal in Chestnut Hill, or Brighton or Alston or wherever you're living, right? Or Back Bay, is a big deal in Ghana or Warsaw or Nairobi, right? Or Buenos Aires, right? And so I think part of it is in the West, when we look at LGBT stuff, we all want things to kind of move faster and be more open. But the idea that these small steps, are not big steps elsewhere, I think needs to be kind of challenged. Do you know what I mean? People say, I'll tell you, I put up all sorts of things on my website or my Facebook page, like what the German Bishops' Conference says or what the Pope says. And, I see those steps forward. People are like, not enough, too little, too late. It's understandable people feel that way. But again, in Eastern Europe and in Sub-Saharan Africa, these are big deals. And we have to remember we're part of a universal church, right? So, yeah. Anyway, so I think that's a helpful kind of piece of advice for all of us, myself included.
Thank you. One of the benefits that I've gained from being at the STM is it's incredibly diverse and international student population. It's going to be St. Ignatius, a parish, being on a Boston College's campus. It's a pretty diverse undergraduate student population as well, and so I've noticed to myself how to put this. I guess intellectually, I was able to kind of comprehend and wrestle with that, but I've experienced that in a much more personal way in my engagements with others and their own journeys toward this.
Like when someone tells you what it's like for LGBTQ people in their country, and you're just like, what? And it's shocking sometimes. And, there are bishops in other countries who have actually supported like the criminalization. Supported the criminalization of homosexuality. And so, again, when we hear these things that seem like small steps, to remember, what that's going to be like in Accra, right, in Ghana. How's that going to be heard? And so I think that's also, when we think about Pope Francis is doing, I think that's one reason, for gratitude. He's still pushing this stuff, nonetheless.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. So friends, I have a few more questions for Father Martin before we shift to the Q&A portion from the crowd. So folks who are watching along, if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, if you in the chat, instead of sending them to everyone, send them to Mish Toth, M-I-S-C-H Toth, labeled as a panelist. She'll be able to kind of navigate that and facilitate that for you. So go ahead and send those to her if you have any questions. So kind of, in a conversation about more diverse identities, larger community, in your book, Building a Bridge, you write very much about how the church and the queer communities, that neither of those are monoliths. And as you and I are two white cisgendered men having these conversations, right? Like there are a lot of identities and voices that aren't being expressed in this exact moment on screen. So especially in light of that principle of Cura Personalis, right? Caring for the whole person. What can queer Catholics do, or allies of queer Catholics do, to help support folks in maybe in other marginalized communities? How can we make sure that we focus, right, like not just on the white gay man, but on the diverse voices, especially like a trans woman of color, other voices? How do we support those folks?
Well, I think first by recognizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And look, let's say an uncomfortable truth. I talk to a lot of LGBT groups at parishes, and it's often white men, right? It's often well-off white men, right? And a lot of times I've noticed, not even, I mean, like presenting the question of women being there, right? It's white men, and it's almost self-perpetuating. So I think the first thing is recognizing it, and in a sense being able to be, kind of do an examination of conscience and be critical about it, and to say, why are we just white men? Now I don't know who's on this call. I can only see 3 faces. But yeah, exactly. And is it just gay men? Are there lesbians? Are there, as you say, is there transgender people of color, right? Genderqueer people. Also people from different income backgrounds. Right? I know Chestnut Hill very well. Chestnut Hill is a fairly wealthy area, Newton around there. And how open is the parish to people who might be from different income levels, different educational backgrounds? So maybe white people that aren't as, well educated, formally educated. So I think the first thing is to ask ourselves, to recognize, and then to ask ourselves, why is that? And how can we reach out to people and just make them welcome, just help them to feel welcome. I think also the leading edge, for LGBTQ people is the transgender experience, right? And that can be very unsettling for people. For many reasons, and there's still questions. I mean, I say this on social media all the time. I'm still learning about transitioning and medical care for trans youth, right? I think it can also move us out of our comfort zone, right? Because we need to listen. And there's bigger than me that I can't be really, I'm not an expert on, but then there are questions of gender in terms of the transgender experience, and then the gay man or the lesbian woman experience, the bisexual experience, where it can be tense. But the key is, it's all about welcome. Jesus is always doing this. Jesus is always meeting people who make other people tense. There's that line from the woman at the well. The story, he's going through Samaritan territory. I love this story, particularly because of this. And there's 3 reasons why he shouldn't be talking to her. 1, she's been married 5 times and living with a man, not her husband. 2, she's a woman. And 3, she's from Samaria. And, boy, you could translate that today in terms of the transgender person who feels, for many reasons excluded, right? Or the transgender person of color, right? Who feels like the woman at the well, who feels excluded for a number of reasons. And what does Jesus do? He goes out to that person. So I think that's the person we should go out to. And the disciples, when he comes back from talking to the woman at the well, it says that no one dared to ask him why he was talking to a Samaritan woman. So they know that he's doing this on purpose. And I think so. So another thing is actually going out and trying to bring them in to the center. Although, as Greg Boyle says, we find out that the margins are the center, right? The center moves.
Erasing the boundaries of our love until there are no more boundaries.
There's no us and them.
How very Pauline body of Christ. I love it. My final question for you before we shift it back to Mish. In your newest book, Learning to Pray, the last chapter you title "Now What?" So again, my last question before we head into this broader section is, with maybe the wisdom gained through our conversation, with the wisdom that you have, now what? A lot of our conversation has been focused on the queer experience, but a lot of folks watching this are allies as well. So how can the laity, maybe other clergy, better accompany queer people during Lent and beyond?
Well, for allies, I would say 3 things. I always say 3 things. 1, listen to them. And, again, it's hard. As Americans, I'll speak for myself, certainly as a Jesuit, we think we have all the answers. Like, so, but really listening to LGBTQ people, LGBTQ youth, listen to their experiences of church, of God, of society, right? It can be very, even for me, as I've been doing this for a couple of years now, to hear a young person, wow, it's such a different outlook. So listen, be friends with them. And I mean real friends, not just kind of token friendships. And then I think one of the most important things an ally can do, which is difficult, is to advocate for them, even at the risk of some pushback, right? In your family, among friends, sometime in the parish, but probably not at St. Ignatius. The story of Zacchaeus, where Jesus is passing through Jericho and reaches out to the tax collector. Why is he on the margins? He's kind of hated because he's colluding with the Romans. One of my favorite lines, I'll tell you two parts of the story that just blow me away. One of my favorite lines when Jesus reaches out to Zacchaeus is all who saw it began to grumble. Because showing mercy to people on the margins always infuriates some people, right? All who saw it began to grumble. And I asked the great Dan Harrington, formerly of STM, about that. And he said, all means the disciples. All, panta is the Greek word. That's the first thing. The other thing that blows me away is this, and maybe this is a good place to end, since this is being sponsored by St. Ignatius and BC, and you're in school. So get this. So in the Zacchaeus story, I love this, and I just found this out a couple months ago. In the Zacchaeus story, so the tax collector who's excluded has to go out on a limb to see Jesus, to do what everybody else does because the crowd's blocking him because he has little stature. I mean, how much does that sound like LGBT person in the church who has little stature, who can't encounter Jesus because of the crowd, right? Who has to do something extraordinary just to do what everybody else does, who's called down, who feels joyful when he's welcome. This is all in Luke. Who the crowd grumbles about when he or she or they are being welcomed. But my favorite part is this. At the end of the Zacchaeus story, Zacchaeus says, if I have defrauded anyone, I will repay them 4 times over, and I will give half my money to the poor. So it's a sense of kind of he has a conversion, okay? Now, what's really interesting is if you go back to some Bible commentaries, believe it or not, because we've all heard that story a billion times. Believe it or not, what he's saying is in the present tense. I am giving half my money to the poor. Okay. I do repay anyone I've defrauded 4 times over. So one of the things that just gives me goosebumps when I read it was that the conversion that Jesus is looking for is in the crowd, because what he is doing is revealing to them the person who is on the margins who's already good. And I think that's what the church needs to understand, that the LGBT person, I'm sure all of you on this call are already doing good things, are already leading, doing very many holy things. You're not perfect, of course, but for the church to understand that and for the church to reveal that, like Jesus reveals to the crowd, is really important, I think. And so for an ally, can you lift up and reveal to your brothers and sisters and siblings, in parishes and schools, in your families, the goodness of your LGBTQ friends?
Wow, thank you.
You're welcome. That really blew me away. I read that. I was like, I can't believe that.
So if it's okay, we can jump right into the Q&A.
Great.
Okay, so we have a question from Laura, and I can allow people to talk and ask the questions if they're comfortable with that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So Laura, you should be able to unmute yourself.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here with us this evening. It means a lot. I just wanted to ask, as a parent and an ally, raising children, young LGBTQ children in the church, what can we do? Is there any advice that you have for us parents to help us navigate our young adults with their sexuality, gender identity, such that they feel loved in our home and in the church, is my question.
Yeah, thanks. I always say this to parents because I don't have kids. I have 2 nephews, but before I answer, what do you find helpful? You're the expert more than I am. What do you find helpful?
This is all very new to me, so that's why I'm here and asking. I like what you said about listening.
Yeah.
I think that's good. But I have an introverted child, so there's not a lot of talking quite yet.
Sure. Well, like a lot of kids, I mean, no matter what the sexuality is, kids don't want to talk about with their parents as much. I would say your answer is embedded in your question, which is the first thing is to love them. To love them, to listen to them, to be open to having your ideas about sexuality and God challenged, because it can be, disconcerting, for the parent, to know that God, is with them. I think so. So listening, loving, right? Being not afraid to ask questions. I think in terms of the church and in terms of the relationship with God, the first thing is to let them know that God loves them, right? That they're not a mistake. God loves them. God loves them as they are. God loves them in their journey. I'm really big on baptism. If they're baptized, they're Catholic. You can say they're just as much a Catholic as you are, as the pastor, as Cardinal O'Malley, as the Pope. They're Catholic, right? Even though some people say, oh, you can't be gay and Catholic. The other thing, Laura, if I can I call you Laura? Is that okay?
Yes.
So Laura, the other thing is, which I think, so here you are in this webinar sponsored by St. Ignatius. So you're obviously someone who's knowledgeable about the church, is to point them to resources that they might not know about and let them know about things that they might not have heard of. So for example, like all the stuff that Pope Francis has said about LGBTQ people, which is I think very positive and open. A lot of kids don't know that. How are they going to know that, right? So to point them to that, to let them know there are parishes like St. Ignatius and St. Cecilia's and the Paulist Center, and I'm showing off a little bit that I know Boston, to let them know that there are places where they are welcome. Because, otherwise they don't know that, and they just sort of, they have sort of stereotypes of stuff they hear on TV or see online. So that's part of it too. It's the parent knowing, where to point them to places that are welcoming, in a gentle way. Now, by the way, I should tell you this is not an ad, but in a couple weeks or months, we're going to start an LGBTQ website called Outreach. It's going to be like a go-to site, and we're going to have all sorts of resources. And some of those resources are going to be for kids too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being a loving and welcoming parent. I love what, was it Aquinas? I think it's Aquinas. Aquinas or Augustine? Maybe any of you can tell me. Love and do what you will. I think that's Augustine. So love and do what you will. Love is the first thing. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for the question, and thank you, Father Martin. And now Austin has a question about becoming a witness to others. Go ahead, Austin.
Oh, hello, Father Jim. My name is Austin, and I speak on behalf, perhaps a lot of us here. Like, what is the best way to become a witness to others as an LGBTQ plus person in Newman centers or in parishes, and perhaps into other Catholics as well? Thanks.
That's a great question. I'm going to ask you to, so I can make sure I understand it. Do you mean a witness like sort of on behalf of other LGBTQ people in the church. Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing is to be yourself, to be Austin. When I was a Jesuit novice, okay, here's a little another, I'm going to show off again. When I was a Jesuit novice in Jamaica Plain, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, Peter Hans Kolbenbach, came to visit us. It was kind of unusual, but he was in the States. And I asked him this question, which I thought was like this brilliant question. I said, what can we do to increase vocations, right? Guys joining the Society of Jesus. He said, live your own vocation joyfully. So I never forgot that. So for Austin to be a witness means for Austin to live his fullest and most authentic life, as a Catholic and as an LGBTQ person. So I think that's the first thing, right? So it would be different than someone else on this call, right? It would be different from someone else on this call, what they would do. So that's the first thing. Be yourself, trust that God has put you there, right? In this situation, this group, this parish, this, the school, this whatever. Second thing is, I think it's important for LGBTQ people, probably more than other groups that might be more like visible physically. Like you can look to see a particular ethnic group or particular race or whatever. That they come to the parish. People, you can look around, right, and you can see that there are people from this country, people from this ethnic group. But by the way they look, right? LGBT people can look all sorts of ways, and so I think it's sometimes important to be a little more open about your presence there, right? So what would this mean? This would mean if you go to a book club to say something like, well, as an LGBTQ person, I blah, blah, blah. The other thing, Austin, is this, and I think this is difficult for LGBTQ people. I mean, maybe, I'm assuming it is, but one of the things that's hard is that, and I would compare this often to, one of my big heroes is John Lewis, the civil rights leader, and I read his memoir a couple of months ago. And it was an amazing memoir because, he was beaten and he suffered all these setbacks. And I thought, my gosh, like, so the person who is fighting for his freedom, right, himself is like going through all this stuff. So in other words, there's a little bit of a parallel with the LGBTQ community because it's like, well, why should I have to kind of go through all this? I mean, why should I be the one that fights for this? And that's kind of how it is right now. So that we have allies, but what am I trying to say? That to be willing to advocate for yourself and to be willing to take some heat. And that's okay. Like that passage from Zacchaeus, all who saw it began to grumble. It's okay that people grumble. People grumbled at Jesus and at Zacchaeus and didn't stop him. So that's the other thing, to be willing to kind of stand up and fight for yourself when need be. It's a good question, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. And we also have a question from Amanda.
I'm glad we can hear your voices. We can see you guys. If you guys want to show us your faces too, say this is a people that longs to see your face.
Hi, this is Amanda Green. Father Jim, it's so great to speak with you. I am the parent of an adult transgender woman. And I think it's a little different being an ally from being the person themselves. It's a lot different. But my question is, as a lifelong Catholic who recently has decided to step away from the church, my question for you is, how is it possible to remain part of the official Catholic Church when some of the bishops, especially in America, and I understand it's different in other parts of the world, different circumstances, but when the American bishops and other church leaders are highly vocal, anti-trans and anti-gay, and not just vocal, but taking away people's jobs and dignity, doesn't remaining in the Catholic Church under these circumstances give scandal to the LGBTQ plus people and their allies who are not in the church? I mean, doesn't it give scandal to publicly ally to an official church, which is so sinful?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I always say that I never downplay the reasons why people distance themselves from the church or leave the church, because that's their experience, right? And I mean, I think it's for many people, it's the only way that they can feel comfortable with their conscience, right? For other people, they say, look, this is my church too, right? I'm baptized. I'm as much a Catholic as anybody else is, and I want to help this church change. I often use, two examples might be helpful. One is I think most of us have gotten so used to it. It's an analogy, so it's not as intense. But there are many married couples. 67% of all Catholic married couples do not have a problem with birth control, and they have made their peace with disagreeing with that very important teaching of the church. They've just made their peace with it, and they don't say that I need to leave. In their consciences, they've made their peace with it. So that's the first analogy I find helpful. There are many LGBTQ people. I was just at Mass at St. Paul the Apostle, which has a vibrant group. They have made their decisions in their consciences that I'm Catholic and I'm staying, and I disagree with this or that church teaching, and so I'm staying, right? The other thing is, I think we can look at it in terms of the political system, in the sense that I'll just say, if you disagree with whoever is president, if you disagree with President Trump or President Biden, a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to leave the country, so that's an analogy too. I'm going to work to make it better, either way. So I guess it's, for some, they feel that their conscience demands that they step away from the church or leave. I'll say for me, I'm just speaking for myself. For myself, I'm baptized Catholic. I took vows as a Jesuit and as a priest, and I think this is the church that we're in right now. And what I want to do is fight for LGBTQ people, and especially, as you point out, Amanda, if I can call you that, especially the anti-trans stuff that's going on. And so I feel the need to kind of stay and fight and advocate, really, because I do think you brought up a really important point. I do think that there has been a movement, like in leaps and bounds in terms of the LGBT community, lesbian and gay and bisexual community. The transgender community, it's stunning to me how targeted they are. But for me, it's wanting to stay and advocate for them. But for others, it's not. So I do understand that.
Thank you. I think that conscience for me is also the most important thing. I feel at this point that the best way I can be an ally is to be out on the margins too. And that really far out on the margins. As I said, as a lifelong Catholic, very involved Catholic, I was in the parish council. I was the chair of the parish council at St. Ignatius. Wow. To feel like stepping aside is right for now, because it's just very hard for me to explain to people who are not in the church, and to justify to my own child, my own family, because it does seem to me that the church leadership is so sinful and so egregious in their actions. But I admire and value and am grateful for people who stick it out, and that was me for a long time.
Yeah, and I understand where you're coming from, and the other thing is, we're talking in Boston. In terms of the sex abuse, that's another reason for people to distance themselves.
Yeah.
And I guess, different people have to look at their consciences to see what they're comfortable with. But for me, look, this is my church, and I'm not leaving. For other people, it's different. I know that for LGBTQ people, it's very different, and it really runs the gamut. What I'm trying to do is work for a church where people won't have to ask that question to themselves anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And we have a question from Andrea.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. I thought I heard my name, but it asked me to unmute and then my sound went away. So thank you, Father Jim, for being here tonight. My name is Andrea. I am the director of faith formation here actually at St. Ignatius.
Oh, wow.
And it's
an honor to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well. I've seen you. I think the last time I saw you was on my CLA call, probably in September. So great to be back. Always great to see you and hear from you. My question as an LGBT minister in the church relates to, how can LGBT Catholics sort of reckon with finding fulfilling relationships in light of, church teaching. I think especially about a lot of the church teaching I've seen is about chastity and sort of not engaging in such relationships. And a lot of, in those spaces, I think there's, from people that I know, and I've, from my own personal experience, there can be a lot of guilt and shame, and even just marginalization that can happen, I think, from that, from feeling outside of that. So I think, how can we as people reckon with that? And then, trying to finding, a long-lasting, loving relationship in our life.
Well, again, what have you found helpful?
Sometimes I think words of wisdom are really helpful, but I think, I don't know if you have any like texts that you've recommended from either like books or folks from, I think lived experiences is really important.
Yeah, I think to think about three things. Number one, Jesus in the Gospels and how Jesus treats people. Look at how he treats the woman at the well. She's had 5 marriages and she's living with a guy who's not her husband. Look how he treats. Look at how he treats her, and look at the care that he takes with her. Second, church teaching. We got to be clear about that. And then third, conscience. I think the analogy of Humanae Vitae, it's an encyclical against birth control, right? That there are many. Here's what I think has happened. I think that the church has come to understand that many straight couples, married couples, use birth control. They don't fulminate about it from the pulpit. They don't send out these, everyone's going to hell. They don't have, big letters about it. They don't have campaigns. They don't have this. They don't have that. Why is that? Well, it's because that they've come to understand and they've come to know married couples who are good people who in their consciences have made this decision. And they know them, right? So priests know them, and DREs and director of faith formation people, and bishops know them, and so the church knows them in a sense. I'm speaking mainly for the West, but I think this is true, more and more worldwide. And straight couples who use birth control don't have to ask themselves, how can I continue to be a part of the church, and how can I do this, and because they've trusted their conscience. And I think the same is incumbent upon LGBT people. To look at what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, to carefully look at church teaching, and to come to understand something in your conscience, the final arbiter of the moral life. Jim Keenan at BC always used to say that, always does say that. And that's an informed conscience. And my gosh, someone who's the faith formation director of the parish, understands church teaching, and to trust your conscience on these matters is very important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, I've heard that phrase from 1 or 2 times from some of my classmates. I was
the other thing is, Andrea, I'll tell you something. I'm sure you know this. You probably teach this. And for people who are on this call, that may sound like kind of some new thing that I've made up, or, it's so liberal. Oh, you Jesuits. That's church teaching. And what's happened over the past 30 or 40 years is that's kind of dropped out of church teaching, not officially, but for a number of reasons, people haven't talked about it a lot. But that's church teaching. The final arbiter of the moral life, where God's voice echoes in our hearts, says the Second Vatican Council, is conscience. Thomas Aquinas said he'd rather go against church teaching than conscience, right? So really listen to that and respect it and reverence it in yourself and in other people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And keep up the great work.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Andrea. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, but I do have a final question before we wrap up. So I believe it was in Building a Bridge where you had mentioned the need also for LGBTQ plus Catholics to also treat the church with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. And so I, as a transgender Catholic, I always find this very hard to navigate, especially when some bishops will call for dialogue, but not include LGBT people in the dialogue. But I came across this quote yesterday, and I hate it because I know it's true, but that anytime we draw a line in the sand to divide ourselves, Jesus is always on that other side with the other person.
Wow, that's a great
And
quote.
like I said, I hate it because I know it's true.
That's a great boy. That's really.
And I've definitely gotten better at encountering people, especially with the synod on synodality and going to different sessions and talking about the importance of encounter and walking together. But I guess, what is your advice, or do you have any suggestions for LGBT Catholics who don't know what it means to treat the church with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, or why they should, or, you know, why they deserve it?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When I wrote the first, one of my first talks was at St. Ignatius up in Chestnut Hill, and I'd still just written the first edition. The second edition I changed because I realized that it's not a, you know, for a bridge, it's not an equal bridge. The two lanes aren't equal. And it is the institutional church that has marginalized the LGBTQ community, not the other way around. So I was very clear that the onus is on the church. Nonetheless, because we're Christian, we want to treat, for example, bishops with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Why do we do it? Because we're Christian, right? And we want to treat people with respect. I think that's just a Christian thing to do. We want to treat them with compassion. They do have difficult lives and difficult things to, you know, imagine, I always say this to people, and this is not to say that in some way they're suffering more. I'm just saying, what does a bishop have to do? He has to deal with, here's what he has to deal with: sex abuse, money, parish closings, people complain about the liturgy, very few priests, I mean, on and on. So, you know, he has a tough job too. And sensitivity is kind of knowing kind of the limits of his job. The other thing is, I think just practically speaking, I think it works better. Now, I've gone back and forth on this, and I've talked to a lot of LGBT, as you can imagine, a lot of LGBT groups. There is the need for, from time to time, protest, right? And that's a charism, and that's a sort of an honored part of the church. So, but I actually think, I mean, I may be wrong, and maybe I'm saying this as a Jesuit priest, but I actually think that sort of working quietly and respectfully with church leaders, I may be wrong, actually works better, meaning you move ahead more. And so I think there's the Christian reasons for trying to treat them with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Then there's the practical reasons. So I think, so for example, let's take an example to make it more concrete. What would have more effect? Protesting and throwing, you know, whatever, like glitter bombs or something on some bishop that you disagree with, or priest you disagree with, or sitting down with them and sharing your experience, Michael, yourself, right? I know you're not saying that you're you know, suggesting the other thing.
No,
I really do think that it's the second thing. I just do, and I know people disagree with me, and they say, well, that's too Pollyannish, but I just think I think in terms of what actually works, you know what I mean? Like, if you really want to move the ball ahead, I think that works better, because they're human beings, right? And they respond to things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's the practical reason too. But by the same token, I'm very clear now to say that the onus is on the church. It's not an equal partnership. It's not like, oh, we've both done these terrible things. Mm-hmm. You know, someone said to me recently, well, you know, LGBT groups, you know, have been really harsh to the church, and I said, well, yeah, but they don't have the power over the bishop to, you know, they can't fire the bishop from his job, whereas the bishop can fire an LGBTQ person. So we have to be clear about that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's a long answer to your good question.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I know I just struggle with that immensely. And,
it's hard. I mean, Jesus says, even if we consider them, which I don't, but for an LGBTQ person who considers them their enemy or their persecutors, we know what Jesus says about that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And I've often, I mean, I'll definitely admit I have considered some bishops enemies at times for the things they've said, but then also kind of reconciling that with what Jesus teaches us to do with our enemies.
Right. To pray for them, to love them, but also in the case of a sort of mythical or anonymous bishop, I really think that what changes them is stories and encounters and listening to people. And I had an encounter with a bishop a couple years ago who came to vet me, basically. I'll leave it a little vague. And so he was kind of hammering tongs about the book. And at the end of the meal, he said, okay, okay, I get it. I get what you're trying to do. It was very nice. And then he said, he was fairly conservative bishop. And then he said at the end of the meal, let me lay my cards on the table. I said, all right. He said, my favorite nephew is gay. And I'm having dinner with two benefactors of the archdiocese who are a gay couple. And I could see that's what's going to change him. I mean, my book, I hope, but that's what's going to change him. His nephew and this couple encounter. So that's what I'm saying, Michael. And if I said, if the nephew, if someone's protesting outside of his office, you have a right to do that. But I think more likely it is the other stuff that changes people.
Yeah.
This is why Jesus taught in stories and not in arguments.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, I think, it seems like the questions have all been answered for this evening. So thank you again. Thank you, Nick, for beginning the session. And thank you again, Father Martin, for being part of it and sharing your wisdom with us.
My pleasure. I want to say thanks to Mish and to Nick and to Michael, especially for setting it all up. I'm very grateful to be with all of you. There's Mish, welcome back. I'm really grateful to this group. I spoke to you a while ago, I think when the book was coming out. I also want to say I'm really grateful to the parish. I love St. Ignatius. I've worshiped there. As I said, I was ordained there in 1999. It's always felt like a home. And I just want to say thank you for being a welcoming place for LGBTQ people. And thanks for doing that particular kind of ministry and being a real beacon in Boston. So thanks very much and God bless you.